Grief. Grief is infinite. Grief cannot be confined to a simple set of stages or rules. Grief is everywhere and looks different for every person. Grief is shapeless, heartless, hopeful, changing, and healing all at once, but never at the same time. Grief is an enigma, a paradox. Grief must be entered into and given time and attention to. Grief is not a passive experience. Grief is work. This is the Allegory and Elm podcast. My name is Andrew May, and I'm here with my co-host Katie May. We're here to talk about the 5 stages of grief, which are anger, sadness and depression, denial, bargaining, and acceptance and healing. We explore this topic and ask the question, what is the shape of grief? With chatting about grief, I wanted to start by giving some context. If this is the first episode you're listening to, you may not have any context at all. So my mom was diagnosed in 2013 with a glioblastoma brain tumor. And that's devastating enough, but most people with that diagnosis are given about 2 years to live. And we were able to get, 5 years more with my mom. But throughout that process, there was quite the grief journey for me. And then we also had an episode on miscarriage, which also was a very big part of our grief journey. We also had an episode on infidelity and an affair that I had very early on in our marriage. And that was also like a death of our marriage and a grief that we had to both work through. So grief is a huge part of the May family journey. Katie and I have really had to kind of just on our own, work through what grief looks like and how to, how to make our way through it. What is grief? Grief is an ocean. It comes in waves and it tosses you around from stage to stage without any regard of what you want. What are the 5 stages of grief? Anger, depression, and sadness, denial, bargaining, and acceptance. I would argue that there are more than 5 stages. Guilt, envy, and healing come to mind as stages that are not in the Fab 5. Stages of grief are not a start-to-finish process where you go from point A to point B to point C. The stages are constantly interchanging, and it feels more like being taken under by a giant wave. You are struggling for air and fighting against the current, but everything you do seems to drag you deeper or bring you further into despair.
I feel like grief is an invitation. It is an invitation because it shakes up your entire world so much, and you have a choice. You have a choice of whether you push it down, like anything hard in your life that you might come across or feel, and you can push it down or try to avoid it, try to numb it out, or you can sit with it and be curious about it and invite it in.
Yeah.
I'm really feeling super charged to talk about this because I think grief is so much more a part of all of our lives than we give it any credit for. And unresolved grief, I think, is really instrumental in sort of like anything in our unconscious, guiding us without us really knowing it.
Right.
So I think the invitation is, do you sit with your grief in an awareness and really inspect it and learn from it, and I feel hold it sacred? Or do you go on unconsciously with your grief and let it kind of run you instead of you really crafting an experience from it that you want to have?
Right. Yeah, I love that just way of putting it, because it is an invitation to either do the work, which is, kind of what I talked about in the intro. Grief is a lot of work, and it requires a lot of you to, assess what is going on. one thing I think is helpful is to take what's internal and bring it external to just kind of get it out there so you can actually explore it.
Yeah. And it's so painful. Like, I don't want to discredit that in any way because I think we're in a better place with our grief. I mean, not that it doesn't still surge and hit us hard at times from different angles of things we've grieved, but it's so painful. And I mean, you were even sharing last night how glad you were that you documented your grief journey with your mom. I mean, part of it, I think there's still part of it that's not been like documented in the same way, because when you're in it, like your thinking and your feeling is so heavy and deep. And when you get kind of through that really hard part, it's hard to like go back to that.
Right.
So I think it's hard for people to want to enter in because they know it's going to be so painful.
Right.
And I wondered if you would talk a little bit about that and like your experience with diving in, because you did dive in a very creative space. And I think created some really beautiful work to share with other people. I think so that you could process, but also to help other people have a visualization of the grief process.
Right. Well, I'll start by saying this. So in like echoing what you were saying about an invitation, like if you are grieving something right now, like someone has just passed away, or you're going through a divorce, or you've lost a job, or you've found out about an affair or something like that, some sort of grief, like what Katie is saying is there's an invitation available for you to, it's not a fun party invitation. It's the type of invitation where you are going to go through hell and it's going to be a lot of work, but I feel like you will come out on the other side a stronger, better person from like having done the work and focused on it rather than just letting it sit and boil and fester inside your heart, your soul, your whatever. I was just in a really dark place in terms of, I was in a place of just kind of keeping a lot of that stuff inside. And I needed something for me to be able to take what was internal and just try to understand it a little bit better. I couldn't comprehend how my mom, who was relatively young, was had cancer and was going to die, because that just wasn't part of the blueprint that we had. It was not part of our game plan. And it just kind of came in and wrecked everything. And so you're a little bit blindsided, and denial is often like one of the very first things to set in. You're like, this can't really be. But I found that like, photography is my main gig. It's what my business has been built on. And art's always something that I have just enjoyed and found to be really helpful in my life through music and through, photography and even through creative writing. So this kind of combined a good number of those things. The creative writing actually was just a byproduct. I really just wanted to create images, but I decided to take the 5 stages and create images around each stage of grief. And so with that, it really helped me to it was almost like an exploration of each different stage. And, I don't want to give away all the spoilers here at the beginning, but you realize it's not stage 1, anger, stage 2, depression. You bounce all over the place with everything, and you're so confused. And so I just really, I needed to be able to take what was going on in my heart and put it into film, digital, into pieces of art that could kind of speak what I was feeling. And I think what ended up being really cool through sharing the project with others is, you could have 10 different people look at one image and all get different things out of it. So some of the time, like Jessica, the model the person who was modeling for me, who had also lost her mom to cancer, she, picked her own images to do her own like simultaneous project kind of thing that we released on Instagram. And she picked certain images for denial or for bargaining that I was like, no, that's anger. Like, and that wasn't me feeling like, oh, I'm the artist, I'm correct. It just was a lesson to me of, oh, it's not denial or anger just because you say so. Like it's up to the interpreter, it's up to the viewer to ultimately kind of decide what it means to them. And so I think for the individual who is creating, like I had my own interpretation and my own perspective of what I was trying to put out into the world. But then also what's great is people are able to see it and decide for themselves.
Make their own meaning.
Yeah.
That's so huge. I mean, I feel like the one thing just as an observer that I noticed through your grief project, honestly, I was kind of worried about you for a long time as your mom was going through her illness, because I felt like you were really internal a lot, and I felt there was like this rage inside of you that I didn't really know what to do with. And I even think I had told someone who had asked me how you were doing, like it was a close friend. I was just like, I'm kind of worried. Like, I don't really know, and I don't really know how to ask because I'm afraid of what I'll hear. And so when you started working on this project and you put it out, it actually gave me like a sense of peace for you, because I knew then that you were actually like working through it and processing as much as you could at the time, because this was before her actual death, that you worked on this. It was actually right during her last few months of life that you were working on this, I think, like the summer before she died.
Yeah,
or the spring.
It was.
Yeah. So she was like in hospice.
That's when, so it was year 5.
So, I think for me, watching you do this project, it actually was healing to see the work that you were putting in and knowing that you weren't just stuffing it down and kind of boxing it up. And because I didn't know before that. And I think that it was a really beautiful thing to watch the process unfold. And it helped me find some peace. Not that that was the end of it by any stretch, because we can talk about that after the fact. But after her death was a whole different process of grief.
I think part of it too was like I felt really isolated, and somewhat kind of my faith journey was in Jesus, and with Christianity was very like intermingled with my mom's cancer journey and her ultimate death. And I felt so isolated because I felt like I was the only one who was moving away from God and Jesus and asking different questions. And it just made me feel like I was on an island. And that's super isolating. And I feel like that's where like depression came into play for me. Sadness and depression. It was like, I felt like, how could this happen to my mom? But just like asking for help and asking for guidance from, Jesus or God, and just feeling ignored entirely. And then, eventually asking questions like, hey, is this all bullshit? Like this, I don't think it's bullshit to have faith in something, but like for me, it really made me kind of question, like, what do I really want to believe? And what, her death made me think, like, what happens after you die? Like, that's interesting that you say that about just where I was at, because I mean, it was a dark, dark place to be. And I don't know, I'm normally pretty open with my feelings, but when you just are that confused and you're thinking like really fucked up thoughts, like suicidal thoughts. I had suicidal thoughts on like 1 or 2 occasions, and it wasn't ever like suicidal thoughts like, hey, I'm going to act on this. I've never in my life felt so low as to think that was even an option. And so like it was the first time I had actually thought of that as a viable or potential option. Like, I think under normal circumstances, you're just like, no, that's not a choice. That's not even on the table. But like all of a sudden it's on the table because your headspace is somewhere else. It's somewhere different. And you've been protected your whole life from, essentially things like this, and something that's out of your control happens. And I feel like the lack of control is where the rage came from. I didn't have any control over what was happening around me. And so it just made me so angry. That is where I spent a lot of my grief journey, was just so internally frustrated, externally frustrated. My internal frustrations just kind of manifested themselves in, little tiffs with Katie, or interactions with my kids, or just frustrations with other people and how good it seemed they had it, and how hard things seemed for me. So again, you'll hear reflections of kind of my faith journey as well intermixed with this. So anger. Any anger I have felt along the way has been mostly directed at a God that I thought I knew, one that was benevolent, or at the very least merciful. My anger comes from a place of not being able to comprehend the injustice of it all. Why would such a caring, loving, sweet woman be afflicted with such an ugly, dark, messy disease? Why towards the end here has she lost the ability to verbalize how she feels, or to simply say our names? It's anything but simple. I don't blame God for her affliction, but for allowing it, for continuing to remain silent while I am begging him for mercy for my mother. Anger is not always obvious. I spent so much energy living a life of bottled up rage that it was difficult to see how anger manifested in my relationships. The thing about grief is you don't always recognize the emotions you are feeling. Anger seems pretty obvious, as we've all felt it before, but it's not as obvious when you don't deal with the anger. It can attach itself and become a part of you, corrupting all the good in your life because you can't allow yourself to find contentment. Anger. Shit.
Just let it come, man.
Anger has made So, I'm crying right now. And I just want to point out that, like, your grief journey is never over. And you never, golly, Pete, you never have an idea of what is going to set it off. I think the reason I'm crying right now is because of how far I've come. And I can't read the sentence that says, anger has made me feel stuck. And anger made me feel really stuck for a very long time. And it's been hard to work through that, but I think the reason I'm so like ugly crying is because I'm so happy and proud of like where I'm at now. And I don't think I would be here if it weren't for putting in the work towards my grief, but also having support from, the people around me. Their love and their like just allowing space for me to feel what I needed to feel. And so I encourage anyone who is dealing with some sort of grief to really allow space for people.
And for the anger.
Yeah.
And would you say anger is maybe the place you stayed for so long because you didn't know how to like call it anything else? Like the feelings that were underneath the anger? Because I feel like I've heard, I mean, I think Brene Brown talks a lot about emotions, and I think she's done some research that when you ask people to name emotions, like there's basically like 3 emotions that most people can name, and that's it. Like anger, joy, and fear, or something like that. That's not exact.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of people stick with anger because they don't know what else to call it. But underneath, there's actually a lot more emotion. It's not really anger. It's like whatever else, regret or shame or whatever you've listed as additional processes. But I don't know. I don't know if that's what you experienced or not, but
it could be, and I think it's entirely valid. I think that there was probably prior anger at myself from the affair that carried into that as well. It was, it sounds really silly, but we think silly things all the time. And part of me, was thinking, is this punishment for, what I had done that was so wrong? And I don't think that's how things work, but your mind will tell you just some really messed up shit. And so I do think there was shame and regret and all of that kind of like bled into anger. And a lot of the anger it was directed at God. It was directed at myself. And some things that I found helpful with anger was just throwing rocks into water. Like one thing I found super helpful throughout the whole journey is getting out into nature and exploring. And that's where I found my solace, was out in the mountains where it's still and quiet, or by a river where it's flowing and you can kind of feel the natural just flow of life. And that's where I had a lot of my just my moments to connect with my mom, even though she wasn't there. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of where I started a journey of like the spirit world, essentially like connecting with someone's spirit when they're not even there. Almost kind of Star Wars-y and whatnot, and less like Christian-y.
Can I tell the story about...
Yeah, you can.
So Andrew had kind of gone one evening to kind of have some time to himself, and I had taken our girls over to see his mom, and we were kind of all just hanging out, like not in her room, because sometimes she would get a little bit restless or agitated if we were in there for very long. And so we were kind of hanging out, and her caregiver came out and was like, she just woke up and asked for everybody to come be with her, which was unusual because she really wasn't verbalizing much at this point and hadn't really asked for anybody specific, or we didn't even know if she really knew we were all there or what not. So we all came in and we just sort of were with her and spent like a few minutes around her, just, loving on her. And when I got home that night, I asked Andrew what he had done, and because it was kind of a rainy, like not very nice night. And you were like, I just drove up on the parkway and parked off on a side and started like talking to my mom. And I was like, what time was that at? And you were like, like around 5:45 or something. And I was like, oh, well, that's really interesting, because around 5:45, your mom like explicitly asked for us to all be with her. And I don't know, like you can take that for what it was, but I personally just feel like her spirit had traveled like around to you. Like she felt you talking to her from a distance, and I think she just like knew you weren't with us there, but like wanted people to be with her. I don't know. I just feel like the spiritual connection of people and people with nature and all in between, like it's deep. And I don't think we really give that a lot of credit. And I feel like one thing I've learned through just this grief journey and death is it's really opened my mind to the possibilities of our spirits.
Right.
And it's actually giving me a lot of peace.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, it's interesting with, with cancer, I guess specifically, because a lot of times with like if someone dies and they're in a car wreck or something, like you don't really have time to you're just kind of blindsided by it, and that's a different type of grief altogether. And with my mom's, it was like a slow progression of everything. And so like when she was in hospice, as she started to kind of lose who I considered to be Nan May, that's when it was harder for me to connect and harder for me to go. And I get into that in denial, like, which we'll get to in a second, but it was hard for me to go back and visit with her because it didn't feel like it was her. Mm. And I had an easier time going into the mountains and connecting with, her almost as if she was already dead, and just kind of talking to her, mm-hmm. or her spirit, or however you want to phrase it.
I feel like, I cannot relate to losing a parent like you can, but I feel like when I was going through the grief of our miscarriage, I was just it was very lonely, even though there were people that I knew that had a miscarriage. Like your grief is your grief. And I think my initial, and I don't know if you experienced this, my initial thing was like, oh, well, at least I have, like my own head was saying, like, at least I have a kid and at least I have a healthy child. And, or at least I don't have metastatic cancer, or, like you kind of want to rationalize it. But one of the chaplains I work with told me that has stuck with me is you cannot compare your grief. Mm-hmm. Like your grief is sacred. It's your experience. Because I think people also can say some really dumb shit when people are going through hard stuff. And I've done it too. Like I think we just get uncomfortable. We don't know what to say. And then we say like the stupidest fucking thing that mm-hmm. comes out of our mouth. But people would say to me like, oh, well, at least you didn't have a stillbirth. At least, you didn't even get to like see your baby or meet your baby. Like, yeah. Or at least you have a health, like people said that to me, like at least you have a healthy kid. And I just remember feeling so angry that people would try to minimize or take away my grief mm-hmm. because it made them uncomfortable.
Right.
And I don't know if you experienced that at all with your grief, but I feel like it's certainly something we should all consider, is how to hold space for people when they are grieving. Because the truth about it is if you're human, you're going to have grief. And it's not even necessarily even over the death of a loved one. Sometimes it's losing a job or losing a marriage, or, realizing that life isn't what you thought it was going to be. That can all be grief.
Right.
But I just wondered how you kind of felt other people treated your grief process or your experience that you were going through.
Sure. Yeah. One thing I would say is like, if you don't know what to say, like, I am so sorry is a great thing to say. I love you. I'm here for you. Things like that, not things to like take your insecurities and put it on the person who's grieving. Like just very simple facts that are true. Like, I love you can be a fact. You do love the person. I am here for you. Like, whatever you need, I'm here. Those types of things and those types of people who show up in that way, I think are very helpful when you're grieving. And, we had so many people bring meals to my my family, just friends that really like showed up and, made a sacrifice themselves for someone else who was going through a hard time, and just showing up and smiling and being, not trying to fix the problem, but like, I think that was a really beautiful thing, that just a beautiful lesson I learned of compassion from other people. My parents have some really good friends. In terms of like how I feel people may have like negatively perceived me, I may have been a little bit more immune to it. Like I think maybe after the fact, hearing like certain people be like, whoa, Andrew was in kind of a dark place, or like, I'm really worried about Andrew. Like even you. Well,
that was because I didn't know, but like once I read your project and like saw your, like that's when some people got concerned for you.
Yeah.
That's when I actually felt relief for you.
Yeah.
Which is
ironic.
Interesting. But
yeah. I feel like navigating different people's grief is really challenging. We have this woman who, she has a husband and 4 kids, and those 4 kids all have spouses and children of their own. And so you've got all these different levels and layers of grief. And there are certain ways that people will deal with their grief. And, I love my dad. I remember getting very frustrated with navigating what I perceived as denial. It felt like a constant positivity about, like, in the face of, what I perceived as just something that was so dire. And that's just how he went about handling his own grief. And that may have worked perfectly well for him. And I know that I like judged the way he was grieving. And I don't think that is helpful for anyone who's listening. Like, if you have a person who is dealing with grief and it kind of like, you feel like it negatively affects the way you're grieving, try to explore that. I don't know if it's helpful to talk to I never really like talked to my dad about it because I wanted to respect his journey. I didn't want to make him feel like being positive was a bad thing. I remember just kind of feeling like super frustrated with having to navigate that.
Well, and I'm sure others may have like felt differently about your grief process.
I'm sure. Yeah. I may have family members that like saw what I was doing with the grief stuff, and they were like, whoa, that's a little bit much. This is a private matter and you're putting way too much out there for everyone else. And, I can't be that much in my head to where I'm thinking, oh, what does, my sister think about me, or my, either one of my sisters or my brother. Like, you just have to not worry about judgment. Either way, you judging others or others judging you with grief, you really have to focus on, what is this teaching me? What can I learn from this? And how can I grow from these experiences? Because I cannot change what's going on.
Right.
But I can change like how I go about dealing with this. I do want to jump into depression and sadness here for a second. So that's another stage of grief. So depression and sadness, and they kind of like lump those in together. This one has hit me super hard. Depression and sadness take on many forms. Sometimes it comes in the form of tears or a snotty, ugly cry. Sometimes the depression takes me so deep that I yell out in anger and frustration at how fucked up the situation is. Sometimes a song or a story will trigger an emotion that I didn't realize was there. This is one emotion that people who are grieving should not neglect. It is one of the harder emotions to deal with because it is the most painful to face. Anger is a familiar emotion, as we have all felt that before, but depression can be something that we constantly wear without realizing it. It can become somewhat elusive if not addressed head on. People who are grieving must allow themselves to feel every ounce of pain and sorrow. It is the only way to move forward. If I'm out in public and I get emotional, I've had to force myself to just allow it to happen. True healing comes from accepting the brokenness, acknowledging it, and then allowing yourself to be changed by it. Depression chooses you. Depression is a path that no one chooses. It chooses you. Depression leaves you feeling bare, stripped down, and strangled, as if the rope is tightening, suffocating you, and you are helpless to do anything about it. I do want to describe some of the images as well, because that's a big part of this. So with depression, I really wanted to show brokenness. And so there's images of being stripped down and bare and feeling strangled. I had pictures of Jessica. She basically stripped down. She was naked and had we were out in the woods, and her husband that was there. It was all cool guys. I wanted that to just illustrate that feeling of just vulnerability. When we're naked, we're pretty vulnerable. And so she's got ropes tied all around her, really tangled up, and her hair's crazy messy, and she's just kind of grabbing her head. That for me just kind of showed those feelings of suffocation and feelings of being stuck and not being able to get out.
Bound almost.
Being bound, yeah, not being able to escape. This ties into anger, and we got some cool depression photos out of it. But for anger, she had, I guess, throughout her journey, she had gone to a junkyard and just smashed plates. And so that was her idea, was to go to the junkyard and smash a bunch of plates and have me, take pictures of it. So we got some cool photos of her taking a baseball bat and busting through a mirror, and then of her smashing plates. And I got chills, within the first 10 or 15 minutes of working with her, because she just did some stuff that I don't think I would have directed her to do. She picked up some of the broken plates and put them in front of her face and acted like she was cutting her neck with the plate, and I was like, holy shit. And I think that her personal experience that she had with her mom really helped to make this project way more than it would have been if I had had someone who didn't have that experience.
Yeah, she was able to tap into that real raw space.
Yeah.
She was amazing.
Depression is one of those where I feel like it's very important to pay attention to. Did you ever experience depression with the miscarriage?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think depression is so layered for people. I think there's such a stigma around depression and anxiety and mental health in general. And so I think for a lot of people, it's hard to admit that depression. I mean, I think sadness is a little bit more acceptable for people to say, I'm just so sad. And it's not you don't get the oh, you're sad. It's
right.
If you say you're depressed, it's oh, we got to fix this.
Yeah, we got to get you on some meds, and we got to.
So I think depression is something I totally agree, especially a part of grief it's important to pay attention. I think it's something that can really teach you a lot too about yourself. And it's a process, just like the whole grief process is, I think, to figure out ways to cope with depression from grief. And I think that's where a lot of people don't really dive too much into that part of the process. I think anger is easily accessible. I think denial, you don't even often, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but I don't think you often even really know that you're in denial,
right? Or
shock, because you're shocked and you're in denial. I think that bargaining is another one that's, a little bit funny, but that people don't often give credit to. And then obviously acceptance or healing, I think you ultimately will get there if you go through this process. But depression and sadness, I feel is something that people just, oh no, I don't want to. So I think that's the stage that's most risk for numbing out.
Yeah, numbing out to and not entering into.
Yeah.
Yeah, it feels like a really murky pool of, or a swamp essentially of to where you cannot see what's in there, and you have the choice to go in and explore it and see what you discover, or you have the it's back to that invitation that you were talking about. The invitation to get into the depression swamp is available to you. But yeah, most people avoid the swamp. Most people avoid diving in and feeling what's in there.
Yeah, totally. It's scary. I mean, you don't know. I think the unknown is what people fear the most. And I want to say, like, if you have used medications, for depression and that's helped you tremendously. Like, I have no judgment against using medications. I want to be very clear about that. But I also want to say, like, medications can help, but they aren't going to completely take away the depression until you're willing to go into the swamp and really inspect those parts of yourself that are pulling you down.
Yeah.
It can help you. It can help with chemical imbalance. It can help with your mood and stabilizing things. And I'm not a mental health professional, but that's just my own personal view of, medications. I think it's perfectly good to use medications as a tool in your toolbox, but it is not going to completely fix your depression, especially related to grief.
Right. Yeah. And one of the themes that keeps coming up, that kept coming up for me throughout the whole process was to feel, simply to feel everything and to allow yourself to feel it. And to not avoid it. So please don't avoid depression and sadness. I know it sucks, but it is very important to focus on it.
And get help. There are so many amazing therapists, grief counselors, bereavement specialists, friends who've been through, a friend doesn't replace a mental health professional, but get help.
Yeah.
It's okay to ask for help to navigate this.
Yeah. So I want to jump to denial next. And denial is tricky because by the very nature of it, you don't realize you're in denial because you're just denying.
When I remember you thinking, like, before this project, I remember you saying, like, I don't feel like I've really, like, been in denial.
Ha 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 ha.
So
yeah, we'll get to that because my denial was very makes me sound like a very selfish person. Denial. There's a certain darkness to death, grief, and loss. I'm not trying to paint a pretty picture of it. Denial is one of the first stages of grief to strike. Your mind can't comprehend what is happening in your reality. Denial is tricky because no one admits to being in denial. The state of denial is declaring something to be untrue. You can't wrap your head around the circumstances. Sometimes we hide behind death and don't allow ourselves to face our deepest, darkest fears. Fear of the unknown or fear of losing someone we had once held so dear. We deny ourselves the opportunity to grow and to heal. Hiding from our emotions, fears, and grief is one of the worst things we can do for ourselves. Talk about how you feel and allow yourself to feel every bit of the pain, the anger, the jealousy, the sorrow, and even the respite. My selfish denial. Denial grants full permission to hide behind your brokenness. My mom's cancer has broken me. My brokenness has come in witnessing my mom slowly die. My denial is my reality. It is more safe. My denial has come most when I go over to my parents' house, Nana and Papa's. If I don't go back to the room where she resides, where she is bedbound with no energy, clinging to what little life she has left, then I don't have to believe that it is real. I can remain happy enjoying the company away from her. This reveals something truly awful about me. My denial has caused me to want to stay away from my mother, to even wish for death to take her. At this point, it would be a mercy. Denial is currently causing me to miss out on final moments with my mom because it can be too painful to see the state she's in. My denial is self-preservation from pain.
I think that's like the last sentence. Wow. I've read this before, but denial being a self-preservation, I think that's so true. It's our brain's way of trying to protect us from something really awful.
Yeah.
And so it's normal. It's natural. But it's going to keep you from being able to really fully embrace the experience of grief.
Yeah, I think throughout my denial and in protecting myself from like having to face what was really going on with her. I guess some regrets that I do have, I wish I had like been with her more and just like read to her, and treated. I think it was just so hard for me to see my mom in that state. So like, going up on the mountains and talking to her spirit, I wish I had the ability to like just sit in her physical body presence where her spirit was also residing and speak to that.
Yeah.
And to just like read to her, or to, she was to a point where you couldn't really ask her questions about her life or anything like that. But, just communing with her in that sense. But I like I said, I think it was too hard for me to like stomach.
I feel like I just had another epiphany about grief is it really calls you to a different place of courage.
Yeah.
Like just hearing you say like, I wish I could have done that, but it was too hard. It's like, that's the call of courage. And I'm not saying you were uncourageous. I think you did the best you could in the moment with what you had and what you could survive. But it just is interesting to think about, not only is grief as an invitation, but grief as an opportunity to really be courageous.
Yeah.
And in processing it and moving beyond. I think working with patients and families at the end of life in my job, I've learned that denial is very, very often present, and different people are in different phases of grief at different times too. And so I think that's really complicated because you might have the person with the illness in a different phase of grieving than their family, and how to help navigate that situation is very challenging. But one thing I've learned about denial for people is, one, there's a space for it. Absolutely. I think denial helps protect you sometimes in a place where you have to move forward in a certain way and you need to be in that denial for a period. But when it becomes a barrier is when it's keeping you from being able to be in the moment of what is.
Yeah.
And I think I hear you saying that with your denial. It kept you away from being in the moment of what was and just being with your mom.
Yeah, my mind went all sorts of different places. I do think meditation has helped to like sit in something that like, we're so overstimulated. Meditation kind of forces you to just sit still and be. And so that's a strong encouragement I have for people, is to sit still and be in their grief. And
whatever that is, whatever meditation is for you, maybe that's a form of prayer. Maybe that's like just literally sitting in silence with your breath. Maybe that's listening to a guided meditation. I think that there's a lot of ways to look at the use of meditation in your life to help you just be present.
So I want to dive into bargaining now. A constant bargain. Every day we inch closer to death. Every second we are alive, we are 1 second closer to our inevitable death. It makes us constantly in a state of bargaining. We bargain with our time, attention, and money. Grief or no, we all bargain on a daily basis. It's just part of the human condition. I found that bargaining for me came more so with what I alluded to earlier in navigating other people's grief. So I had it's a bargain. It's bargaining is essentially like, I'll give you this if you give me that kind of thing. And so like, I'll allow you to, handle things the way that you feel like you need to, but like, you gotta let me do the same thing. So it's almost this unspoken handshake between people. And I really respect that. Like, people within my family did not try to make me feel differently. I think there were times where they didn't understand me.
Still don't.
Yeah, that's fine.
I don't know.
I don't know. I guess I'm just a different breed.
That's good.
Yeah.
Diversity is good.
It sure is.
I think for me, bargaining is really like this place of saying, if I do this, or if you do this, then we'll have this, which I think is important to think about in a daily life. But with grief or with illness, I think it's often like, if I am so faithful in my faith, that then God will heal me. Or if I'm so committed to this treatment plan, then I will live as long as possible and I will have healing or I will be cured. I think I see people bargain all the time in illness and death, and it's like I think we feel like we are like almost entitled to, if I do this, if I follow these rules, if I live this way, then I will have this life. And I was actually having a conversation with someone yesterday who's in their mid-30s like us, and they had been raised kind of with like a very specific, like if you study and work hard and you'll get good grades and then you'll be able to go to college and then you can be a doctor and then you'll have the perfect life. And it's like he was saying the older he gets, the more he realizes like that's just not how it works.
Yeah.
Like, yes, it is important to work hard and, be a good person and do the things that help you be the best you can, but it doesn't mean you're going to then get this perfect life or this life that you have visioned for yourself. I do believe like you can manifest your life, but it doesn't mean hard things aren't going to happen or bad things aren't going to happen.
Right.
It just means that you're human.
Yeah. Yeah. And I feel like we try to bargain with like a higher power too. Like with God, like through prayer or through, just asking for healing or whatever. And I think that's where I became really frustrated with like God and Jesus and started really asking, some deep questions of like, if you have a parent that is constantly ignoring you, like God and Jesus, you may start to ask other people for advice or for their perspective. Bargaining, I feel like was one of the things that kind of like drove me away from prior faith that I had.
Yeah, I think it's our efforts to control the situation, and then you realize you don't have control over the situation. And so I think that bargaining, I think, hits people at different times and in different ways, but I think it's almost like when you realize that there is no bargaining that can change the circumstances of this situation or your life, it's almost like the catapult into the process of healing and accepting what is.
Yeah, I almost like, and I caught myself from doing it, but I almost was just like, I don't spend too much time on bargaining. Like, just very flippantly, like, don't waste your time. But it's part of the process, and if that's where you're at with things, you need to kind of explore that. Because it's easy on, I don't want to say on the other side, because I'm not like healed in like fully healed, and I never will be. But I do feel like what you said, bargaining is a futile effort, and it's, there's no point. But like, I think where bargaining was beneficial was in allowing other people to experience their grief and not forcing my shit on them, and vice versa. That mutual
understanding,
that understood bargain of we're going to respect each other. I think bargaining in terms of respect is like mutual respect is a very important piece of bargaining.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's easy to say like, oh, well, don't bother because you won't really get what you're bargaining anyway. But I think it's part of the process, right? Like it's part of the grief process, and your mind's going to do it regardless. So lean into it and see what it has to teach you. Yeah.
And try not to treat it like it's stupid. Like it's stupid to ask your God for a miracle. Do it. I wouldn't squelch anyone from like trying to bargain or trying to speak to their God and ask for that. Let's jump into acceptance. And this is kind of, acceptance is like the fifth stage. And I remember having very vivid ideas in my mind of what types of photos I wanted to take for acceptance. I wanted this like epic sunset with Jessica like on these mountains, like arms spread wide open, looking out to the mountains, and
like I'm free.
yeah, this like freedom that came with it. But like what I discovered was that's not what acceptance looked like to me in reality. Like, and through the images, I learned that acceptance, healing was so much more. Acceptance. Acceptance is not a destination. It is a rung on a never-ending ladder. Grief doesn't go away, but we do learn how to better live with the pain and work towards healing. Acceptance comes and goes like the wind. Acceptance does not always look joyful and jubilant. Sometimes acceptance means staring death in the face and realizing you have a choice. You have the agency to allow yourself to be swallowed up by grief or to face it head on and grow from it. Talk about your grief. Whether it was a divorce, losing a job, a death, cancer, a miscarriage, talk about it to people you trust. It's all grief and it all matters. We must learn as a society to grieve boldly. Acceptance does not come through sheer force of will, but through learning how to let go. And what I mean by learning how to let go is not like let go of the person who you love or let go of like your feelings. It's more so just like letting go of the things that we just like cling to. Letting go of the life that we thought we had and learning that like that's not our reality. So we have to figure out like where to go from here.
Yeah. And I think letting go of your expectations or your control over the situation sometimes.
Right. So healing, I think, is it's a better word than acceptance. And I'll explain why. I think any form of acceptance comes through entering into our brokenness. Sometimes acceptance looks more like caressing and honoring the broken pieces, realizing that this is what we have left to build from. Perhaps acceptance is the biggest misnomer of them all. You never truly accept, but more so move towards a better understanding and healing. I think the fifth stage of grief should be called healing. When you heal, there is still a scar, a mark, that shows there was a journey through pain and that you made it out the other side, not totally unscathed. When you break a bone, it heals, it doesn't accept. When your heart and soul are torn to shreds by death and grief, it needs to heal, not merely accept.
So beautiful.
Yeah, so just the idea of not accepting the fact that it's there, you really need to, like, what we've been driving home this whole podcast is to feel things and grow from it. And that's where the healing comes. And I do feel like I'm in more of a healed place. That's why I got so emotional about anger, because I don't like, I still get mad about things, but I'm not like holding on to those feelings aren't as like,
just like below
raw.
The surface, like simmering.
Yeah, they're not simmering, and they're not like right there ready to just burst at the seams, if someone cuts me off in traffic or, they make my coffee wrong or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've felt that, like, from you, like, your transformation has been huge in the past year, I would say, for sure. And I think it's really beautiful to watch someone and walk alongside someone. I mean, I think we've both been healing in our own ways this past year, and we'll continue that process. I think for me, one thing I've really thought about lately is, how to help people die healed. And I've had this thought, really, it's not about dying healed, it's about living healed. Because oftentimes when you approach the end of your life, I mean, I've never been there personally, but walking with people on that journey, you don't have a lot of time when your body starts to fail you to really dive into that healing space. And so the only way to really work toward dying healed is to learn to work through living healed. And so when you have these griefs, when you have these experiences that really affect you, dive in and go through the process, the journey, the hard work, the pain, so that you can find healing, so that you can live the way you want to live. Because you didn't want to live in that anger. You didn't really want that. It was affecting your relationships. It was affecting your creativity. It was affecting your drive and desire. I mean, I think that's kind of what I felt. And now I feel like it's opened up this whole world because you've worked through the process of healing and you're still working through it, but it's opened up, I think. I mean, we wouldn't probably be sitting here having this conversation, starting this new brand, if you hadn't done the hard work of working toward healing in your grief. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I would say, like, it's not just so tied to like death, you know, what you're talking about, living healed. I think that like living a healed life looks like, you know, things that we'll talk about and have talked about on the podcast are like, you know, eating disorders and sex. If those are like things that have, you know, been a source of brokenness in your life, like if you've had a sex life where you don't talk about stuff and it's not pleasant and it's not fun or enjoyable, like you've got to talk about things in order to like start to move towards healing.
Right. It's like that initial awareness has to be there that something's broken.
Yeah. And you have to be vulnerable enough to speak that out loud to someone.
Yeah.
And so that's like a big part of why I told you about the affair. It's why I decided to tell the world essentially about the affair. It's because I am wanting to move towards a life of healing and to speak it out loud and to just kind of say like, it doesn't have, it's not claimed me. It's not, it doesn't have power over me.
The stigma, anymore. Break through the stigma and the shame of it.
Right.
And grow.
Yeah.
Because all of those things I think that we've experienced in the last, 13 years of marriage, I feel like the past 7 have been really instrumental in really pushing us into this space of healing.
Yeah.
Healing past wounds, healing past beliefs, past stories.
Yeah.
And moving into a space of growth.
Right. And I think one thing that's helpful with healing is ritual, which I don't think we've done a very good job at, honestly. Like, I think we did a decent job with the miscarriage. We had that kind of like moment where we
released
flowers into the water, and our buddy Mariah photographed that. And like, what am I talking about? What is ritual? That sounds like one of them woo-woo words.
We're going to sacrifice the lamb.
Yeah, right. So I'll just kind of talk a little bit about ritual, like what it is, because I had no idea what it was. There's things you just don't really know until you like start grieving, and you're like, we should have learned this shit in high school instead of pre-cal. So ritual. What is ritual as it relates to grief? Ritual is a way of marking a death or grief that occurred. It is a way of saying, this happened and it mattered, and I want to honor it. We hold traditional grief rituals through wakes and funeral services. These can oftentimes be impersonal or just focus on celebrating the life of the person. Ritual is about seeking deep personal connection to the event that happened and grieving it in your own unique way. It allows you space and permission to mourn in a way that fits you and helps you to mark the grief. Some people plant a tree, some burn sage, say a prayer, find healing rocks, some bury something meaningful. It is entirely up to you, and maybe there is a way to honor the person that you have lost that is unique to that individual. Whatever you decide to do, ritual is super important as it relates to dealing with grief. If that resonates with you and you are grieving, like, do some research on it. There's a lot of like great books out there.
We could
probably link some. Yeah. Because I think ritual is something that we should like do.
Yeah.
Ourselves. I'm kind of preaching it, but I don't feel like
I think we could use some work on that for sure.
Yeah.
I do think something we have in the works of a plan of sort of like a ritual around rebuilding our marriage is planning a vow renewal. I think that's...
Yeah.
Is that okay to say?
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool.
I think that's
top secret.
Is it?
No, it's not.
But I think that is something that we've recently talked about, and I do think that is a part of a ritual process for our marriage.
So guess what? Nobody's invited to our vow renewal. Sorry.
Not even our own kids.
Yeah, right. I want to end the episode by talking about, it's just the final paragraph. It's kind of my conclusions, and that's what I want to leave everyone with. And these were my findings about the shape of grief. The shape of grief is whatever your grief journey looks like. It is shapeless, but it is totally formed by how much time you put into your grief. You can ignore your grief, and it will take on the shape of denial. You can enter your grief and find that anger, depression, and bargaining are all major players in the walk of grief. Acceptance and healing only come when we have a willingness to enter into and assess our grief. It is best to not compare our grief with others, but rather to share the grief we are experiencing with those we love and trust. Talking brings healing because it causes us to face what has happened. The shape of grief is defined by the individual. It is unique for every person, and the grief is whatever you make it. Grieve boldly. If you want to learn how to grow into the best version of yourself, we are here for you. Make sure to subscribe by clicking the red button below this video and tap the bell to be notified whenever we post new content.
If this video resonated with you in any way, please share with your friends. We would love to reach as many lives as possible. Thank you so much for following us on this journey. We love you, and remember, your story matters.